Good evening, I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. The President of the United States addressing the nation from the White House on the strategy ahead for the Obama administration to combat the Islamic State. 4 parts. 1, in Iraq, airstrikes, counter to using partners in the region. The Iraqi army was mentioned. 2, in Syria, unclear, but pursuing the Islamic State into its stronghold in Syria, in eastern Syria. Raqqa is the city. 3, counterinsurgency, counterterrorism. That would involve not just the uniforms, but also signals intelligence, drones, the paramilitaries, and special forces. And 4, humanitarian effort to support those most at risk in Iraq and Syria. Gordon Chang of Forbes.com is here with me because the president was speaking not just to the United States of America, but to the world. Our adversaries in Asia, in the subcontinent, in Africa, in the Middle East, and in Europe were listening. And we're also joined by Kori Schake of the Hoover Institution. I've asked Kori because Kori often writes of the military and how the military, very intelligent, careful, and necessarily planning ahead people, because these are the sharp ends of the stick of the United States foreign policy. Here, presidential speeches when he is addressing a matter as grave as blood, as treasure and blood. And what we heard tonight from the president was treasure, yes, but the qualifications had to do with boots on the ground. Kori, a very good evening to you. The President of the United States in his 4-part strategy tonight spoke of airstrikes, but he was keen to emphasize no boots on the ground. Help me understand how the military hears that. Does that mean it's not ours, we're not going to get involved, or they'll only use a few pieces of us? Good evening to you, Kori.
Good evening, John and Gordon. My sense is that what the military will hear, the majors at Fort Leavenworth going through the strategy curriculum at the Command and General Staff College, will hear the enormous gap between the president's description of the threat and the timid, stingy means that he is willing to put forward to address it. He wants to win a war without engaging in combat. He wants to build a broad-based international coalition while limiting us to the margins of contribution. It just doesn't work. There's not a strategy in the president's strategy.
Kori, there are Americans in Iraq. They are working with Iraqi forces. They do wear boots, and those boots do touch the ground. And I heard that actually some of them have been using laser-guided weapons to paint targets for American warplanes above. It seems to me that we actually do have people there, don't we? Or am I not understanding what's going on here?
No, you're right. The president is drawing a sort of careful semantic distinction. So yes, of course, there are target spotters in the country for the airstrikes, but also the pilots flying these airstrikes are engaged in combat. We do have combat forces in Iraq. We don't have, what the president means is we are not going to be a contributor to the ground forces that will win this war. And he tacitly acknowledged in his speech tonight that this war has to be won on the ground. But we are somehow going to be leading the effort without contributing to that.
The president presents to the American people the horror of the murder of Foley and Sotloff. And in that horror, the nation was enraged and is now ignited to do something about it. But did he provide what he's going to do? Is he going to bring justice? Will he track them down? We can hear FDR making this speech. Did he match him?
Oh, good Lord, no, he did not. The president was very vague about what this long-term strategic undertaking entails. And he certainly didn't strike fear into the hearts of our enemies. As Jim Mattis, the former CENTCOM commander, always points out, telling your enemy what you will not do gives them the opportunity to adjust and move into those spaces of vulnerability. That it's a terrible idea for the president to convey both to our allies who we are trying to recruit to this effort and to our enemies what the limits of our willingness to solve the problem are. And the limits the president put on this engagement are so insufficient to achieve the aims he outlined tonight that it will actually frighten our allies and embolden our enemies.
Gordon, immediately, how did Beijing hear this? Because Kori is referencing the rest of the world watching this speech.
Well, they've heard this speech probably 2 or 3 days ago. Susan Rice, the National Security Advisor, is in Beijing. She talked to Xi Jinping. She talked to senior Chinese foreign policy analysts. And I think that what she was trying to do was two things. First of all, to give them a heads up at what the president would say. Also, to enlist their support in the fight. And the interesting thing here is that in many ways, Beijing has much more at stake than we do in Iraq. The Chinese pump more than half the oil of Iraq. And clearly they've got an economic stake. We really don't need Iraqi oil. And so I think that there are some pretty interesting conversations, especially because Beijing has now put in about 900 essentially combat troops under the aegis of the UN, but basically they're there to protect Chinese oil in South Sudan. So clearly you've got the Chinese right now very engaged in this because they've got economic interests.
Kori, the president is speaking as if the Islamic State is another version of Al-Qaeda. And I think in the past he's made the mistake of calling it a junior varsity. We'll give it a varsity status right now. But they have taken territory. They're operating with equipment that they've taken from the Iraqi army. They're conducting themselves, I've seen some of the videos because they put out a lot of propaganda, as a crude version of a symmetrical warfare force deploying against their enemies on front lines. Defeating Al-Qaeda never involved combat troops. I don't recall us ever actually saying we're going to send a division in to find Zawahiri, but that's quite different than what we're looking at here. Does the president believe we're up against Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria?
Well, several people in the Obama administration, including Matthew Olson, the head of the National Counterterrorism Center, have said that the Islamic State is actually a greater threat than Al-Qaeda ever was. So, again, the dimensions of the threat are so much larger than the means the president is bringing to try and degrade and ultimately defeat it, that if I were Bashar al-Assad and if I were the leadership of ISIL, I would be feeling pretty good after hearing the president's speech. It was all about limits and timidity, not about a determination to kill people who have terrorized Syria, are terrorizing Iraq, and are picking up momentum throughout the world.
Right, take continents and destroy people. Right, that's what military force does when it's unleashed.
And the president's focus on the 2 American journalists who were killed by ISIL, the way that that sounds to the people of the Middle East is that the president is unsympathetic to 200,000 dead Syrians because we did nothing during the last 3 years that the Syrian civil war has been burning. But 2 dead Americans, and we expect countries all over the world to sign up and help us deal with this problem. It sounds very solipsistic to others, which is why the president's actually going to have a pretty difficult time putting this coalition together.
Kori, I couldn't agree with you more on what you said about the president's indecision and unwillingness. But the question is, will the president be forced to put in American ground troops, despite what he said today? You know, if you go back and look at Vietnam and the increasing commitments, are we going to see the same dynamic here?
You know, Gordon, I'm so glad you asked that because I have the same fear. The worst way to get involved in a war is to creep into it incrementally. A few hundred troops here, a few hundred more there, expanding war aims that you don't adequately resource, but that you have made political claims about that then create pressure to ramp up, to escalate your involvement. This notion of just do a little bit, and then if we need more, we'll do more. That's the kind of thing that frightens allies and that it encourages our enemies to keep fighting us. Instead of making clear that you will bring whatever force is necessary to achieve your aims and stop this threat in its tracks.
Kori Schake of the Hoover Institution, Gordon Chang of Forbes.com, the President of the United States, the four-part strategy: Iraq, Syria, counterinsurgency, and humanitarian relief. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show.